Welcome to my channel. Hit the like button, share, and subscribe. In this video, we'll be touching on one of my favorite artists of all time, Barry White. Barry White was born into music. His mother, Sadie Mae Carter, was no ordinary woman. Born in Galveston, Texas, she had grown into a brilliant musician and dancer. Talents that was completely underappreciated in her hometown as she drifted from one dead-end job to another. With a population of 60,000, Galveston was one of the oldest cities in the southwest of America and was famous for its cotton. It was a charming town, but a place of no hope for someone with big ambitions. Eventually, Sadie realized that she would have to leave Texas to have any chance of fulfilling her dreams. Sadie knew where she wanted to be, and that was Hollywood, where she knew she would shine. However, Hollywood was unattainable, so she sought the next best thing. In 1929, at the age of 16, with life passing her by, Sadie Carter decided to leave. Some of her cousins had already moved to a small town in South Los Angeles called Watts, and that was her opportunity. She saved up as much money as she could from working in clubs and bars, and one day packed herself a single suitcase and got on a train to Watts. When Sadie arrived in Watts, she thought it was paradise, and in many ways it was. At the time, only 20,000 people lived there, and the vast majority were aged under 21. Her particular talent was song and dance, and her routine was said to be spectacularly good. She also possessed striking good looks and quickly found work in minor roles. Her first big success came when she was just 18 years old in 1931. Appearing in a film named Tender Horn, directed by W.S. Van Dyke II. Sadie was well paid and got to meet all the giants of the film industry, including Darryl Zanuck and Louis B. Mayer, both of whom knew her by her first name. By the time she turned 28, she had appeared in 3 good movie roles, 1 for MGM and 2 for 20th Century Fox. She was also a big success in her local community, and every Sunday her singing was a treat for the congregation at the Greater Tabernacle Baptist Church of Los Angeles, where she performed gospel songs for the members. At that stage in her young life, Sadie Carter had it all: a sparkling 10-year acting career, good looks, and a personality that endeared her to everyone. She was dedicated to her craft and had no time for boyfriends. Everything was going fine in her life until the day she met a man named Marvin White. 33 years old, he was the man of her dreams, and she didn't need to be asked twice when she met him on the street and he asked her out. On September 12, 1944, she gave birth to her first child, Barry Eugene Carter. A couple of years later, after Melvin's continued sporadic visits, Sadie had another son, Darryl White. As the children got older, Melvin began to show more interest in the boys, but his desire to spend time with them was still lackluster, at least. Soon Sadie found out that Melvin was married and had 2 children. She left him, and for 20 years, Melvin was not a part of their lives. To support the family, Sadie became a piano teacher and taught him how to harmonize when he was only 4. She sang Silent Night and he sang the harmony. However, despite this early exposure to music, he never learned how to read or write music. Even though he could not read or write music, he was playing the organ and singing with his church as he mastered other instruments as well. By the age of 11, he appeared in his first recording. He played the piano on Jesse Belvin's hit, Good Night, My Love. 2 years later, Barry's voice cracked, something that he said was the most devastating thing he ever experienced. However, that voice, a rich bass baritone, would become one of the distinguishing features of his music. By 16, White was arrested for stealing tires. He and his younger brother Darryl had teamed up to become a two-man gang, terrorizing his neighborhood. Barry has said, "It was a very heavy place to live. It was rough and tough, and you had to learn very quickly how to survive. There weren't a lot of kids in Southeast Los Angeles who were into music." His years in Watts undoubtedly shaped his outlook to life and were the main factor that caused him to end up in juvenile jail. The atmosphere in Watts, the most prominent borough in South Los Angeles, fostered resentment because of discriminatory treatment by police and wholly inadequate public services, especially schools and hospitals. Sadie did her best to overcome this and bring her sons up as good citizens, but was fighting a losing battle. As Barry White recalled, "I was brought up in the mean streets where the edge of danger and defiance carried an adolescent lure like an advertisement for macho. It made me want to be part of something big and tough. It gave me false courage and allowed me to think I could get away with anything." Barry found that the teachings of the pastors did not match what was going on outside the church walls. White knew that many of their neighbors who went to church on Sunday and prayed were in fact gang members and hardened criminals from Monday to Saturday. The neighborhood was plagued by gangs of black youth who made it their battleground, so much so that when Hollywood was making films of a violent nature, the film crews always headed for Watts, as they knew they would not have to construct any sets to get the right effect. Unsurprisingly, Barry and Darryl White were drawn into this violent gang culture, mainly because they didn't know anything different. Darryl was sent to juvenile hall for the first time at the age of 8. From then on, he was in prison more than he was home. Barry pursued a life of petty crime, but was a little smarter than his brother and never got caught. As a young boy with no father to act as a role model and set me straight, I couldn't help but get sucked into the street life. I really wasn't a bad kid at heart, I just didn't know any better. White's descent into the street life got worse when he became involved with a gang called the Businessmen, which translated as meaning taking care of business, and no one doubted what that business was. At that time, South Los Angeles had 5 main gangs, and the west side of the city was even more gang infested. The Businessmen were the most famous gang in Los Angeles, as White described them. They were the oldest, baddest, and most envied gang in South Central. The leaders of the Businessmen were old established, and it had become almost a job. The elders were more than 50 years old and had been members as their full-time occupation for a whole lifetime. By the age of 10, White was involved with what he called gangbanging, and he had learned how to fight. More importantly, he learned how to defend himself from other kids in the neighborhood. They were our missing fathers, and the streets became the only living rooms we ever felt comfortable calling home. We were the businessmen, which meant we were in the business of taking care of business. White's membership with the Businessmen endured from the ages of 10 to 16. He and his brother were involved in many gang battles where they and as many as 30 or 40 youth would battle each other for supremacy. People died in these battles, and although Barry White never mentioned whether or not he killed anyone, the general perception is he most likely did. Sadie was devastated by the fact that both of her sons were involved with gangs. In 1956, he performed at his first ever recording session. Sadie was invited to play the piano at a recording session for Modern Records on a new Jesse Belvin album. Belvin, in his early 20s, was a singer-songwriter who was rapidly making a name. He had had his first hit in 1953 with a song called Dream Girl. Belvin was a family friend of the Carters, born in Texas and spending his early youth there, where he had to get to know the Carter cousins and recommended Sadie for the job. The lead song on the album was called Good Night, My Love, which had been especially written by George Mottola and John Mariscalco for Belvin to record. Sadie arranged for her son to play the piano chords for that song, and 11-year-old Barry took over the piano. He was ecstatic to be in the same room as Jesse Belvin, let alone to be playing for him. His favorite song was Earth Angel by the Penguins, which Belvin had co-written and had become a huge hit in 1954. Shortly afterwards, with Barry having turned 11, Sadie Carter made the decision to get out of Watts. It was fast becoming a war zone where gang warfare was constantly raging. Homicides were running at 10 a week, fueled by the uncontrolled sale of drugs. It was getting worse rather than better, and the Los Angeles Police Department had virtually withdrawn from the town. Sadie put together the fee from the Belvin recording and the money she had put away from giving piano lessons, and found a small house to rent on the west side at 42nd Place in Hoover. It was a step up from the small apartment in Watts. She hoped she could get her young sons away from the lure of the businessmen, which was corroding their childhood almost to the extent where she was losing control of them. Her move away from Watts came in a period when lots of the more prosperous African Americans were getting out, and Sadie was right to leave when she did. Barry found it hard to make the break from the businessmen, although at least they were no longer on his doorstep every day. It turned out that being a member of Los Angeles' most notorious gang had actually protected Barry White from his most serious excesses. Once separated from the gang, he became a serious criminal in his own gang, a newly created one with just 2 members, the White brothers. Barry and Darryl sank deeper and deeper into the street life, and eventually, Darryl received a 50-year murder sentence. Barry was incarcerated for a few months for stealing $30,000 worth of mechanical or car equipment. Barry did a short time in juvenile hall, and with all the personal turmoil going on in his life, he was having more luck with his ambitions to break into music. The 3 days that followed his release from prison proved to be some of the happiest days of his life. He spent most of his time with his mother, Sadie, learning how to live on the outside again after 7 months of incarceration in juvenile prison. He kept remembering the Elvis Presley song, It's Now or Never, repeating the lyrics to himself and feeling an odd reassurance that everything was going to be all right. To his intense surprise, the resolutions he made inside to change his life was more difficult than he had imagined. He found himself itching to get back on the scene and rejoin his old friends in the gangs, and that he might have done, were it not for a surprise knock on the door. At first, he thought it was his old buddies and remembered making a grab for his coat, but it turned out to be 3 old school friends who had a proposition for him. The 3 faces at the door were Theo Reed, Leroy Sanders, and Earl Harris. They had formed a group called the Upfronts and asked Barry to join. It was this that fueled his passion to pursue music. It was the summer of 1962, and Barry White was only a few weeks from turning 18. One day I woke up and said to myself, man, you have to go to Hollywood. I just knew it was time to make my own way in this world, and to do so, I knew I had to learn what went on in Hollywood. I knew that Hollywood was where the big boys in the music industry were, and I wanted to see it for myself. Barry went to Hollywood and walked the pavement for 30 days. On the 31st day, he got a break when he bumped into an old friend who invited him to observe a studio session and ended up earning $25 from the session. This is where the magic began. Once Barry decided to get his life together, he married his teenage sweetheart Mary, and at the age of 18, Barry had 3 children and one outside of the marriage that he did not find out about until after she was born. Also, around this time, his father had come back into his life. Both Mary and Barry's father, Melvin, believed that he should give up music and secure a job, but Barry would not give in, and this decision caused his wife Mary to ask for a divorce. Through acquaintances he met while singing with the Upfronts in the summer of 1963, Barry would work with a man named Gene Page, who would be the catalyst for all the success he would eventually enjoy. It's not an exaggeration to say that without Gene Page, there would have been no Barry White. They began writing songs and arranging music together, and their talents blended perfectly. The 24-year-old Gene Page was already a success in the music business when he met White, but the two enjoyed working together, and Page valued White's input on a recording he did called Harlem Shuffle. Page was highly regarded at Motown and everywhere else as a multi-purpose conductor, composer, arranger, and producer. There was nothing he couldn't do in a studio, and it was Barry White's incredibly good fortune to have linked up with him at the start of his career. After attending college, Gene Page wrote and made demos for his brother Billy, who was working with the American Music Company. At that time, folks like Glenn Campbell were doing demos of Billy's songs, and Gene would arrange them. He was soon discovered by Phil Spector. At the time, Spector was the most famous record producer in America and the man behind an emerging pop phenomenon called the Ronettes. Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, the famous husband and wife songwriting team, had written You've Lost That Loving Feeling for Spector, and he was desperate to cut a tape with the Righteous Brothers before anyone took the song. Page admitted later that Spector had only turned to him in desperation. The rest was history. Page's arrangement practically invented the famous Spector Wall of Sound. Word gradually got around, and Page attracted the attention of Berry Gordy at Motown. He was soon working regularly for groups like the Drifters and the Mamas and the Papas, and was arranging hit record after hit record as Motown's brand of music took the pop world by storm. Unfortunately, Page was not getting any of the credit, and it was only during his last year with Motown that Berry Gordy began to publicly credit his arrangements, so Page started looking beyond Motown. He returned to Los Angeles and became an independent producer, immediately working with up-and-coming stars like Barbra Streisand. By the mid-60s, Gene Page was already established as the go-to guy for any pop artists needing lush arrangements of strings to heighten the sound of a ballad. Nobody, it seemed, could put together violins, cellos, and French horns like Gene Page. Page and Barry White remained very close, and Gene would also help Barry financially at times. Page was the first to recognize Barry White's talents and nurtured him where he could. In early 1966, Barry secured a job as A&R for Mustang Bronco Records, where he formed a relationship with Larry Nunes. The Mustang Bronco years were good for Barry White. Everyone now recognized his talents, and he would never struggle again. From that moment on, there was a steady demand for his services, and he was now only a couple of years away from becoming a global superstar. In the summer of 1968, Barry White resolved that he would always be his own man. This promise to himself was tested very early on when he received a telephone call from Hal Davis of Motown Records, then the hottest label and possibly the most coveted, especially for black artists. Davis and White knew each other from his time at Mustang Bronco, and Davis wanted to sign him up. Davis wanted to sign Barry White very badly, and Gordy had already recognized his talent based on a recording White had done in 1966 called All in the Run of a Day for Robert Staunton. White stated, "I had caught the eye of the boys at Motown, and they thought I had a good voice. They wanted to put me on their very impressive roster of writers, producers, and artists. They offered me a heavy salary, expense account, and use of a company credit card." Hal Davis slid an envelope across the table. When White opened it and saw the salary offer, he let out a big, loud whistle. Barry was beyond flattered, and as he read the offer letter, it gradually dawned on him that the label was offering him a very well-paid job. However, he had sworn that he would never be an employee again, so he turned Motown down to their disappointment. Fate had always played a huge role in Barry White's life, and his ultimate success would rely on a series of coincidences and chance meetings that came together just in time to turn away failure and ensure eventual success. Now fate played its hand again, and he met the three girls who would eventually become the group called Love Unlimited and give him his first taste of real success. By chance, Barry White met a young girl named Andrea Trixie Robertson, who would introduce him to three young ladies who we would come to know as Love Unlimited. The three girls were hired as backup singers for a song Barry was working on. Their names were Glodine James, 24, Linda James, 23, Glodine's sister, and their friend Dee Dee Taylor, who was also 23. All three came from very respectable families and had first formed the Croonettes 10 years before to earn some pocket money performing for friends and family. The Croonettes had grown to become well known around the music circuit, and they played gigs every week. When they opened their mouths and started to sing, he recalled, "They knocked me out, and Andrea had been right about the three very good-looking ladies. I was very impressed with their attitude towards what I was doing and their part in it. They were very talented, and like every other black girl group in the 60s, they had grown up with dreams of becoming the next Supremes." Barry White was smitten with Glodine, but they didn't start dating until a couple of years later. Barry White decided he would work on an album for them, and as he sat in the dark thinking about a name, it suddenly came to him. He would call them Love Unlimited. Soon White moved in with Glodine, and although he was still married to Mary, they began a serious committed relationship. White stated in his memoirs that he was deeply in love with Glodine. "Love became the grand theme of my life. It became my work, my soul, and my bliss." White had also admitted in an interview that he had enjoyed at least 80 lovers before meeting and being with Glodine. Glodine also became the spark for his songwriting. Most of his songs were about love and relationships, and he needed that spark. "I loved writing the music that she inspired, music that in turn brought us closer together and deeper in love." The first song that was born out of their romance was "Can't Get Enough of Your Love, Babe," which was released 4 years after it was written. Barry White had $32,500 in his pocket, and finally, all the tools to make an album with genuine chart potential. The first thing he did was to hire Gene Page to arrange the music. His father Melvin came to visit Barry at the studio. Melvin, who only a year before had told Barry he had no talent and should get out of the music business, was intrigued at his son's newly found success and respectable bank account. As Melvin was leaving the studio, he went up to his son and whispered, "I'm very proud of you, son." White hugged his father tight and embraced the proud moment. One night after talking to Glodine, words came to him for a song he was trying to write. He finally called the song "Walking in the Rain with the One I Love." "Walking in the Rain," by far the best song on the album, was immediately scheduled to be released as a single, and no one doubted that it would be a hit. They were not wrong, as it climbed as high as number 14 on the Billboard Hot 100. It also reached number 6 on the U.S. Soul single chart. "Walking in the Rain" carried the whole album, passing $1 million in sales. After the dust settled for Love Unlimited, Barry wanted a male act and envisioned his future as being the Svengali of separate male and female acts. While working on some songs and looking for the perfect male singer to interpret his songs, Barry realized he would have to sing his own songs. It was a revelation that shook White to the core. Prior to that moment, he had never envisioned himself as a professional singer. The title track was "I've Got So Much to Give." Barry took the album to 20th Century Records and secured a $75,000 advance against royalties. The album had 5 songs, and each song was extended with instrumentals. When the music execs heard the album, they did not like the concept, so Barry took the album to Clive Davis, who loved it, and offered to match the deal. That Saturday, record executives threw a party at Larry Nunez's house. Out of the blue, Barry White's name came up in conversation. Elton John was at the party. He knew about White and the new album was mentioned. Elton asked for a cassette recording of the album and sat in the corner listening on headphones. After a half an hour, he put the headphones down and asked if he could take the cassette home. Even at this early stage in his career, Elton John had a reputation for his musical taste. Unusually for an artist, he was an avid reader of the music industry trade magazines and newsletters. He obtained copies of most music in his genre before or on its release and listened to hundreds of hours of contemporary music from other artists every week. If Elton was curious about another artist, he analyzed everything about their music that made them a success, and Elton John was clearly curious about Barry White. After finally deciding to sign with 20th Century Records, the album "I've Got So Much to Give" was released on March 27, 1973. The album went to number 16 on the LP chart and number 1 on the Soul chart, but it was the release of 2 singles that set the world on fire. "I'm Going to Love You Just a Little More, Baby," as predicted, was a huge hit. It went to number 3 on the Billboard singles chart and number 1 on the R&B chart. It was the fastest selling single in the history of 20th Century Records. The title track, "I've Got So Much to Give," went to number 32. It was suddenly a marvelous time to be Barry White. As Smokey Robinson recalled at the time, Barry grooved into being the kind of artist he was. At first, he saw himself as a producer, but after he saw the response he got from people around the world, he grew to like it. But not all critics were as optimistic. As White recalled, "People wrote that I was going to have one album and no more. He's not as good as Isaac Hayes," they said. Critics argued that White's musical style would not endure, and one said it was overly repetitive and lacked the social consciousness that fueled the work of other similar singers. But Barry White shot to international stardom and became an immediate sensation around the world. quickly becoming 20th century's biggest selling artist. If record executive Russ Regan thought I've Got So Much to Give was non-commercial and should not be released, then Barry White's second solo album, Stone Gone, consisting of 5 tracks totaling 35 minutes of music, must have been his worst nightmare. But by now, he was past caring. Regan had given up trying to predict what White's next move would be and had decided that it would be best to just let him get on with it. No one at the label could believe Barry White's success. 20th Century record executives believed that he was riding on an incredible wave of luck, and that the luck was about to run out. Barry quickly picked up the vibes. Even as I was enjoying my ride at the top of the charts, I could hear the whispers in the hallways of 20th Century Records about how I was one lucky fellow. They kept wondering with skepticism in their voices what I was going to come up with next. Although he never showed it publicly, privately it annoyed him that no one had any confidence in his ability to sustain the success. He resented the fact that he was almost treated with contempt by the people in his own record company. Stone Gone was certainly simple enough with only 5 songs. Girl, It's True, Yes, I'll Always Love You, Honey, Please, Can't You See, You're My Baby, Hard to Believe I Found You, and Never Never Gonna Give You Up. This song was one of the surprise single successes of the year. The reviewer for AllMusic summed it up perfectly. His patented mix of love monologues and rich vocal dynamics would come to mark the best songs of the period. White's inventive arrangements of mesmerizing backdrops and vocal seduction display unwavering sensitivity. Another critic called White's arrangements otherworldly and wrote that his grooves were the soul seduction of high-heeled boys and sequined girls that would soon take over discotheques, and so it proved. Another said that his voice washed onto the shores of romantic pop like hot, bubbly bathwater. They called his music sweaty, sexy anthems full of strings that seemed to arrive via moonbeams. He was also by then confident that he knew what women wanted and how to translate that into music. As he explained, "My music deals with the relationship between two people, and I have always written music that people can play during romantic moments. One thing I do is speak sensitively to women. Most men don't do that. They don't think it's manly to express themselves in a romantic manner to women." The release of Stone Gone on October 2nd, 1973 came only 10 months after White had leapt to stardom with Love Unlimited. One reviewer called the new album sensually charged, and it was certainly that. Any fears that the album would not be a success soon disappeared when it quickly reached number 20 in the Billboard album chart and stayed there for a long time. It was number 1 on the Soul album chart, while in Britain it was quickly proving to be White's best overseas market. It quickly reached number 18. By now, even Rolling Stone magazine had started taking notice of Barry White's music, but it was hard to tell whether its review of Stone Gone was praise or not. The magazine called White an imitation Isaac Hayes, the strong inference being that Hayes was the real thing and White was inferior. It stated, "Even if Barry White is imitation Isaac Hayes, who would have thought anyone could match Hayes' pretension for pretension?" To Rolling Stone, Isaac Hayes was a god, and White was the imposter. Soon White was getting tired of the unfavorable comparisons with Hayes and retorted, "He's into his own thing and I'm in mine. I just feel I'm better in mine than he is in his." In hindsight, Rolling Stone got it wrong, as it often did, and Isaac Hayes gradually faded away as Barry White rose to superstardom. Aside from the comparison with Hayes, Rolling Stone had very little good to say about the album. But Rolling Stone was soon proved dead wrong. Barry White was singing the type of songs that women wanted to hear. Romance and seduction, not lust and rampage. It was also being noticed that White was writing, producing, and performing all of his songs at a time when it was unknown for artists to have that much control over their output. In 3 years, from 1972 to 1974, Barry wrote the music and lyrics for no less than 9 full-length albums. He also produced them and performed on them. It was an unprecedented amount of activity for a pop musician, especially one relatively new to the scene. To the world, it appeared that Barry White had come from nowhere and became an overnight star, but only White himself knew that this so-called overnight success had come after 15 years of sheer frustration, struggle, and poverty, when the outlook seemed to be completely bleak. Having achieved initial success with both the male and female versions of himself, he formed an instrumental orchestra. The next album, Rhapsody in White, featured 7 brilliant tracks: Midnight and You, Rhapsody in White, I Feel Love Coming On, Baby Blues, Don't Take It Away From Me, What a Groove, and What a Groove. And if all that brilliance wasn't enough, the last track on the album was the classic Love's Theme, the breakout single that had a vocal version on Love Unlimited's second album, Under the Influence of Love. Love's Theme was recorded with a full orchestra and ran for just over 4 minutes. No one expected it to be a hit when it was released as a single in November 1973. Sales built slowly before it went to number 1 on the Billboard charts for 1 week in January 1974 and reached the top 10 in 25 countries around the world. Love's Theme became one of the best-selling pop instrumentals of all time and also reached number 10 in Britain. It earned a gold record for White, and the whole music industry was stunned by the unlikely success of an 8-year-old song. The 15 years of struggle and reality paid off. Most big pop stars of the 70s were pulled into a whole world of drug-taking, misusing women, and every excess available. But White never even came close to anything like that. For him, success meant striving for more and working even harder to sustain it. When Love Unlimited's second album was done, White was delighted to be asked to rearrange the musical score of Dino De Laurentiis' remake of the movie King Kong. His 19-year-old son, Federico, was a serious Barry White fan and suggested to his father that White would be a great prospect. Dino sent Federico to negotiate with Barry White. He needed no persuading to do the job, and when Federico proposed a $25,000 fee, White agreed. The two men hit it off, and White invited Federico to stay at his house while they spent an enjoyable 2 days in the studio rearranging the theme. The young man took it back to play for his father, who was in Rome doing pre-production for the film. He and Federico's sister, Raffaella, loved it. The De Laurentiis remake of King Kong was a surprise hit in 1976 and the 7th highest grossest movie of the year. It was as though Barry White had sprinkled his stardust on the film. He really could do no wrong between 1972 and 1975. However, the film had a tragic undertone for Barry White. 6 years later, in July 1981, he was sitting in a hotel lobby in New York reading a newspaper when he noticed a short article entitled, "De Laurentiis' Son Killed." He couldn't believe what he was reading. The article detailed how Federico had been the only passenger in a small Cessna that had collided with another plane near Anchorage. His pilot and the pilot of the other plane were also killed. Simultaneously, White's success had brought about a dramatic change of attitude towards him from his wife, her mother, and his own father. None of them had believed he could be successful in the music business and had told him so. Now they were stunned at what had transpired, and deep down they were annoyed that they had been so wrong. By the middle of 1973, White was an international superstar, earning in excess of $1 million a year, and suddenly living in a world where money was simply irrelevant. The sudden influx of money enabled White to organize his personal affairs, and it gave him enough money to finally divorce Mary and marry Claudine, something he had waited a long time to be able to do. White brought 4 children to the relationship, and Claudine brought 2, so they had a family of 6 before they even started. Mary's first step was to hire the best and meanest divorce lawyer she could find. There was a battle concerning 3 of the children, as Barry Jr. had already decided on his own that he wanted to live with his father. Lanice, Nina, and Daryl spent weekdays with their mother, and weekends with their father, but Barry wanted full custody. As he explained, "I wanted to have all of the children to be together and felt I could provide a better home for them." Mary was having none of it, and although she did not really want permanent custody, there was no financial benefit for her in that. Barry was forced to hire his own lawyer to negotiate with Mary's. Mary's lawyer had only one tactic, and that was to continually say no. The divorce settlement looked as though it would end up going to trial, but virtually on the steps of the courthouse, the lawyer finally said yes and won Mary the astonishing sum of $10,000 a month, half for her and half for the children. It was an extraordinary settlement, and the very surprised judge said so. Barry stated, "To me, it wasn't about the law, it was about my children." He also thought that his wife deserved to share in his success. By now, my music was on the radio and in the charts, and Mary and I felt her and the children were entitled to benefit from that. With the divorce settled, it was time for Barry White to remarry without delay. So in July 1974, he and Claudine James secretly flew to Las Vegas for a quick wedding in a typical small Las Vegas purpose-built chapel with just the 2 of them and an unknown witness present. In 1975, just 12 months after his divorce, he had a chance encounter with his ex-wife and their 3 children outside a shopping mall on Martin Luther King Boulevard in Los Angeles. White had taken an old friend, Blanchard Montgomery, to a favorite taco restaurant for a plate of burritos. As they left the restaurant, White spotted Mary's distinctive green Cadillac at a distance on the other side of the road. At that moment, his children also spotted him, and they waved. Mary was with her new boyfriend. The children got out of the car and ran towards their father to say hello and greet him affectionately, as Mary and her boyfriend watched from a distance. White was shocked to the core when he saw that the children were dressed in what he saw as rags. He had never seen them like this before, as they were always immaculately turned out when he arrived to pick them up on Saturday mornings. When he asked them why they were wearing old clothes and shoes, they replied that it was what they always wore. Barry then glanced over at Mary and her boyfriend, who were dressed in expensive clothes and shoes. They were well manicured, in sharp contrast to the children. White suddenly felt he was being conned, and the $10,000 a month he had so generously agreed to pay his ex-wife was not being spent on his children, but on herself and her new boyfriend. What happened next was truly frightening. White literally lost control of himself, not out of anger, but out of blind, cool rage. He had a permit to carry a gun in the car, and his .357 Smith & Wesson Magnum was in the glove compartment. He carried it for self-defense, as he explained. Like every street-savvy musician, I felt the need to be able to protect myself at all times, especially when I was out by myself. He suddenly wanted to kill his wife for dishonoring his children, and the boyfriend too, if he got in the way. Blanchard Montgomery, a wise older gentleman, sensed what was happening and ran to the open car door. He leaned in and put his hand across White's wrist, temporarily restraining him from removing the gun from the glove compartment. After the longest 10 seconds of Blanchard's life, Barry relaxed the grip on the gun and placed it back into the glove compartment. He went over to where Mary and her boyfriend were now standing and looked her straight in the eye, saying nothing. She knew that he was upset about what he was upset about and why. After a few seconds, Barry got into his car and drove away after telling his children he would see them over the weekend. He seethed all the way home, and after dropping off Blanchard, he went home and told Claudine he wanted full custody of all of his children. The next day, White drove to his lawyer's office to see Larry Thompson. Thompson was on a retainer to handle Barry's business affairs. Eventually, he had custody of all 4 of his children. Soon after this, Barry released the single You're the First, the Last, My Everything, and it exploded onto the charts. It was an instant hit. It spent 2 weeks at #1 in Britain and became White's 4th top 10 hit on the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart. His 3rd solo album, Can't Get Enough, would prove to be the biggest hit of his career. 1974 was the year when Barry White and his team would peak in excellence. Headed by Gene Page, the arranger, it included Jack Perry, Ed Green on drums, backup singer Tom Brock, engineers Frank Kamar and Paul Elmore, and the incomparable Ray Parker Jr. Parker was typical of the talent White gathered around him in that period. He had come to prominence as a 16-year-old in 1969 as a member of Bohannon's house band at the legendary 20 Grand Detroit nightclub. He then fell in with a group called the Detroit Spinners, whose lead singer, Bobby Smith, was so impressed with Parker's guitar skills that the group asked him to join their touring act. Through that, he came into contact with Marvin Gaye, with whom he recorded and co-wrote some songs. The first #1 single in which he had a hand was for Honeycomb, an American R&B soul girl group. In 1972, he went to work for Stevie Wonder on his album Talking Book. He was also the lead guitarist for Stevie Wonder as the opening act on the Rolling Stones American tour of that year. That led to session work for Holland Dozier and Holland, which is where he first came across Barry White, an association that was to change his life. Parker was recommended to White by Lamont Dozier. White called him, and he became his life for the next 2 years. White immediately recognized Parker's supreme talent and couldn't stop talking about him. Word soon got around, and he was hired for sessions by most of the greats of the time, including the Carpenters, Aretha Franklin, Bill Withers, The Temptations, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Herbie Hancock, Tina Turner, and Diana Ross. For the next 3 years, his diary was full for every day of the year, as his guitar talents were heard on 1 in every 10 hit albums released in America during that period. Eventually, word of his talent reached the ears of Clive Davis, and he was signed to the Arista record label as an artist in his own right, and the rest was history. His first single, Ghostbusters, went to #1 all over the world and launched him as a major star. It was said later that Parker was the man responsible for giving Barry White the extra zest that made him so successful between 1972 and 1975. Certainly, he was present on every one of White's biggest successes, and White was never as successful again after Parker left to pursue his solo career. Barry's seventh album, Can't Get Enough, revived interest in White's first two albums, I've Got So Much to Give and Stone Gone. Both re-entered the charts as people discovered Barry White for the first time. Ed Green recalled, "When Barry was hot, the guys in the band would be so excited to get back into the studio. We were excited to be part of that magic, and we fed off the thrill of making great records for Barry. He was a tremendously gifted leader, and we wanted him to succeed so we could keep the magic flowing." The end of 1974 was one long party, and the praise lavished on Barry White from all quarters in these 3 months he recalled as being almost embarrassing. By 1975, Barry White was a global superstar. He had put out 11 albums, 4 for himself as a solo artist, 3 for the Three Girls of Love Unlimited, and 4 for his Love Unlimited Orchestra. All of them had been hits except for the disastrous Together Brothers movie soundtrack. He had scored 2 gigantic worldwide single hits with Love's Theme and You're the First, the Last, My Everything, and had enjoyed more than a dozen top 20 singles. He had also found time to produce 7 albums for third-party artists, and his distinctive sound dominated American radio stations for the period. His unique blend of pop, soul, and disco had lit up the decade, and his unique distinctive voice purrs seductively and has captured the moment. Natalie Cole, the Grammy-winning female artist, said, "Barry's rich orchestrations with a pounding soulful drive and those sweeping violins have given new meaning to getting in the mood for love. You know it's him with the first chord and the first word." Equally amazing was the way that Love's Theme became a discotheque hit, the first instrumental to do so. As a result, Barry White was credited with kicking off the era of the discotheque in America, which culminated in the opening of Studio 54 in New York. The mention of Isaac Hayes by any reviewer was sure to spark a reaction from Barry White. He was compared with Hayes at every opportunity, the implication being that he ripped off Isaac Hayes. At first, he was annoyed, but as his record sales climbed, his attitude to the nonstop comparisons mellowed. As he said, "People have started to say Isaac is copying Barry White, but he doesn't really sound like me. He still doesn't. He's into his own thing, and I'm into mine. I just feel I'm better in mine than he is in his." Privately, White thought Hayes was ripping off his music. As he said, "After I've Got So Much to Give, Hayes came up with Joy. He did 3 songs on there that sounded like my first album. I love the production because I believe it sounds like a Barry White production. I listened to it, and it sounds a lot like Love's Theme." Although he has never intellectualized in the manner of his peers, White's legacy was already established by the end of 1975. Whatever followed would just be a bonus. Don Cornelius of Soul Train summed up White's impact best. "There was no match for Barry White. His music is going to live forever." And so far, it is. In 1975, Barry released Let the Music Play. It was the first of White's albums that did not include Gene Page and his immense talents. Likewise, Page decided not to ask White's assistance for his second solo album, Lovelock. Both albums were to suffer badly from the respective absences, but Gene Page was to miss Barry White more than Barry White missed Gene Page. Page tried to explain it away. "Our schedules just didn't coincide, and Barry needed to complete his projects. Opening side 2 of the album was Baby, We Better Try to Get It Together. It reached number 92 on the singles charts and 29 on the R&B charts. It performed most strongly on the British charts, reaching number 15. You See the Trouble with Me was the most promising song on the album, and which was co-written with Ray Parker Jr., although surprisingly, he did not give Parker a writing credit. It was released as a single in February 1976 and reached number 14 on Billboard's Black Singles chart. It was also a big hit in the UK, climbing to number 2 and just failing to reach the top spot by a couple dozen sales. The album closed with the title track Let the Music Play, which was also the 3rd single release. It remains one of Barry White's better-known songs and got to number 21 on the Billboard Singles Chart, number 4 on the R&B chart, and number 9 on the British chart. The album reached number 8 on the R&B Albums chart and peaked at number 42 on the main Billboard Albums chart. He was still enjoying high sales and more or less everything went gold. By 1978, as Barry's contract ran down at 20th Century Records, Barry started his new label, and his brother Darryl was released from prison after serving a 13-year sentence for murder. His return home was something neither his mother nor his brother had ever expected to see. At his original trial, the judge had sentenced him to 50 years and further ordered that the then 20-year-old should never be released back into society. In the state of California, it was automatically an indefinite sentence, with no hope of release. But later, the sentence was ruled unconstitutional by higher courts, and Darryl, by then 33, finally got his freedom after 13 years in jail. Darryl White had been in and out of prison all his life, but when he was released, he resolved never to go back to jail again, attempting to reform and go straight. The truth was that Darryl enjoyed his life of petty crime and showed little signs of reform. Although admittedly after a total of 17 years of incarceration, more than half his life, he would have preferred not to have to go back to prison. A lot had happened during Darryl White's time inside, not least the fact that his brother had become a household name in America and a global singing star. But Darryl was unimpressed, and when he got out, all he wanted to do was lead his own life, firmly rejecting all offers of help and support from his older brother. Barry asked him after his release what he wanted to do. The inference was that he could do nothing he wanted, and his brother would help him with whatever was required. Rather, he could do anything he wanted, and his brother would help him with whatever was required. Turning down the offer of a house in Malibu with a swimming pool, Darryl told his brother that he just wanted to go back to his old neighborhood and lead a normal life. He rejected all of help, and looking at Barry's life, he didn't like what he saw. It was not for him. As long as he had enough vodka to drink and cigarettes to smoke, he was happy. As Barry White recalled to Mark Elliott in his 1999 memoirs, "I knew how difficult it was going to be for him to try and get a job when the first thing anybody was sure to ask was about the 13 years missing from his record." White offered to set up his brother in any business he cared to name, but back came the same response: "All I want is a shoe shine stand. But of course, I ain't really into polishing shoes. The back room is where the action will be." The clear inference was that the shoe shine stand would be a front for criminal activities, albeit low-level petty crime. White recalled, "I sighed and thought, always the criminal stuff, and realized my brother was unredeemable. I told him I couldn't be associated with any criminal activity." White gave up trying to help his brother and instead gave him $100 a week as an allowance. As he told his old friend Jack Perry, "I gave it to him to do as he liked until the end of his days." So Darryl White went back to a life of petty crime, and surprisingly, he managed to stay out of jail. No one knows what he did with his $100 a week, and he always seemed to be short of money. Doubtless, the bookmakers, liquor stores, and numerous local drug dealers benefited the most. Once again, Barry White witnessed his brother's life deteriorate with a sinking feeling of despair. Darryl had been in and out of juvenile hall since the age of only 8, and his biggest problem remained the same. It was the huge chip he carried on his shoulder, genuinely believing that everyone was trying to take him down. Sometimes it seemed that he craved violence. Countless times every day, harmless encounters turned into explosive confrontations that only good fortune stopped from being catastrophes. The situation was not helped by the fact that everything came too easily for Darryl White. He was extremely good-looking and had inherited his father's hunky physique. Women, usually of the wrong kind, fell easily into his arms. But amazingly, for 3.5 years between 1978 and 1982, Darryl stayed out of trouble. He spent his days quietly in a haze of alcohol, cigarettes, and cannabis. Following his release from prison, he hung around with a neighbor in South Central Los Angeles named Ernest Little. Little was 59 years old and enjoyed drinking and smoking, hobbies that Darryl shared and admired. They lived together in a cheap boarding house that had a very liberal attitude towards its residents' lifestyles. One fateful morning on Sunday, December 5th, 1982, Ernest declared to his friend that the day's purchases of liquor and cigarettes would be on him. Little gave him $20 to make the purchases. Apparently, Darryl returned with only the liquor and no cigarettes, and said he spent the whole $20 on liquor. Little didn't believe him and asked for his change. Darryl told him there was no change. Little was angry that his friend was trying to scam him out of a few dollars, so much that, according to police reports, he went to get his gun. When he returned, he pointed it at Darryl and shouted, "You're going to give me my money, Emma Effer." When Darryl repeated there was no change, Little pulled the trigger. Darryl somehow dodged the first bullet, but Little fired again and hit him in the chest. The bullet traveled straight through Darryl's body, missing all vital organs but his heart, and came out on the other side, killing him instantly. The wound was clean and there was very little blood, so at first it seemed that Darryl had merely been knocked out. Little tried to shake him awake. When he didn't respond, Little stood over Darryl's body and cried, barely aware of what he had done to his friend. By then, police cars were pulling up outside, alerted by neighbors. The police found Little standing over Darryl's body, gun in hand, making no attempt to deny what had happened just a few minutes before. He was handcuffed and taken away. With Little arrested and the forensic team having done their work, Darryl's body was removed from the scene. The police searched the home to find details of his next of kin and was very surprised when it dawned on him that the murdered man was Barry White's brother. Eventually, he found details of Darryl's mother, Sadie, and went over to the Sherman Oaks home Barry had purchased not too far from his home to tell her that her son was deceased. Barry and his mother mourned him and kept true to his memory. During all of Barry White's troubled years during the 1980s, he received constant offers to produce and arrange records for his famous contemporaries, but he always refused. While he wanted to develop new acts, he had little interest in being a freelance producer, even though he knew he possessed all the skills to do it well. The offers came thick and fast and were often very difficult to turn down, but he always did. And this was the reason why he never worked with Marvin Gaye, an artist he respected above all. White admired Gaye more than any other performer of the time. Marvin Gaye also deeply admired Barry White and said so in his own biography, written by David Ritz. Barry's sounds have long haunted me. He is both street and sincere. Despite the mutual respect, they didn't really know each other that well. White put that down to what he called Marvin's distinctive, significant dark side. Gaye reminded White of his own brother Darryl, who also had a dark side. As he said, "I knew Marvin had some demons and was fighting them. I couldn't get close to him because of his lifestyle." So White deliberately kept his distance, despite constant overtures from Gaye for them to work together. White admitted that he brushed Gaye off. Marvin was a troubled man, and that is why he and I were not close to one another. If it doesn't agree with me, I keep my distance and let others do their thing. But in 1984, something very strange happened that changed the situation. It was a Friday morning, March 30th, 1984, and White had just returned from a week-long trip to Israel. He was catching up with the news in Billboard, the music industry's trade paper, when he came across an article announcing that he would be producing Marvin Gaye's new album, something he knew nothing about. He had certainly not agreed to anything or even discussed it. Apparently, Gaye had told a Billboard reporter that Barry White would be producing his new album, but had neglected to tell White himself. Then he remembered that Don Cornelius had left him several messages on his answering machine while he had been away, pleading with him to return his call. He also remembered an incident that morning at the airport. He had been approached at LAX by some fans who recognized him. There was nothing unusual about that, and he had enjoyed the banter, signing a few autographs. Then one of them had asked him about Marvin Gaye's new album, and he had been puzzled. Now he knew why. Before he could collect his thoughts, the phone rang, and when he picked up the receiver, it was Cornelius at the other end. "Barry, you're a difficult man to get hold of." After the usual pleasantries, Cornelius said, "There's someone here who wants to speak with you." The next thing White knew, Marvin Gaye was on the other end of the phone saying that he had been trying to get in touch. White replied, laughing as he spoke, "Yeah, I just read about it in Billboard." Gaye came to the point. "Barry White, you've got to produce my next album." White feigned disinterest and said he was not good enough to produce the great Marvin Gaye. He said Marvin Gaye doesn't need a producer. I could never produce Marvin Gaye. Marvin is the only one who can produce Marvin. After a brief but friendly argument, White offered to help out with some arrangements, and the two men agreed to meet the following Monday to discuss it. Gaye told White that he would drive over to his house at Sherman Oaks at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. White gaily said, "I'll be here," to which Gaye replied, "That's fantastic, BW," and put the phone down. Straight away, White realized that he was excited. Not much had gone right lately, and this was a new challenge he could relish. As he said in his 1999 memoirs, "I looked forward to that meeting so much." Gaye called again on Saturday morning and told White, "I'm so excited. This is going to be the baddest album of my career." White replied, "I don't know about that, Marvin, but we're going to put out an album they'll never forget." When he put the phone down for the first time, White realized that Marvin Gaye was serious. The following day, Sunday, White was woken early by the phone ringing at his bedside. Phone calls like that always worried him, and he picked up the receiver with some trepidation. It was Jack Perry, and White said, half asleep, "Jack, what is it?" Perry just said, "Marvin's dead." There was nothing more to be said, and White just replaced the receiver. It was the first of a few calls that morning, including ones from Michael Jackson and Jermaine Jackson, to whom Gaye was said to be distantly related. It was a time of incredible sadness, and even though he hardly knew Marvin Gaye, White was bereft. At the end of 1988, Barry and Claudine White called a halt to their 14-year marriage and a relationship that had spanned nearly 16 years. It came as a complete surprise, but at 44 and 41 years old respectively, they had suddenly decided it was over. White said, "Neither of us wanted to pretend that the spark was still there when it wasn't." He described why he left. "I felt I needed to make some major changes to everything about my life, and that included my marriage. But what was not over was their friendship. That was as strong as it had ever been." As he said in an interview in Ebony magazine, "We had come together as friends, which was why we could part the same way." Throughout the 80s, things slowed down in Barry's career. But in 1989, White was roped in by his old friend Quincy Jones to be part of a quartet that included El DeBarge, James Ingram, and Al B. Shore to sing a song called The Secret Garden. The song went on Jones's 1989 album Back on the Block and was quickly released as a single. It was a hit and reached number 31 on the Billboard Singles Chart and number 67 in the UK chart. In 1992, he performed in London with Lisa Stansfield, who was at the height of her career. She told the audience, "One of my biggest heroes is Barry White." Her number one single, All Around the World, had been directly inspired by White, who said, "She's one of the students in the Barry White School of Music. Lisa used my formula for phrasing, my chord progressions, my melody structure, my style of doubling of the harmony." Great things continued to develop from that relationship, and 5 years later, she successfully covered Never Never Gonna Give You Up, as well as duetting with him on Staying Power for the song The Longer We Make Love. Catherine Denton had come into his life seemingly from nowhere. He had met her while touring, and they had bonded. No one was sure what the relationship was about, but by this time in his life, Barry White needed someone to take care of him, and Denton happily filled the role and would do so for the next 9 years. White had fallen head over heels in love with her at the age of 49, and she was just 24. Despite the 25-year age difference, they were in sync with each other almost from the get-go. She was 21 when they first met, and consequently, they took time to get to know each other. He told Jet magazine in 1998 that she was one of the sweetest girls he had ever had the privilege to know. He appreciated the simplicity of the relationship. Among her best qualities is that she's without games and always willing to listen and learn. After 30 years of relationships with strong, independently minded women, Catherine Denton was a refreshing change. It was a true love affair, and the pair would often sit up until the early hours of the morning. As he described, "We talked about nothing at all, but anything and everything." And he admitted that it had taught him some new things about relationships. "I found that a good relationship is sharing your mind as well as your time with another human being." There was no question of marriage, however, as he told Mark Elliott in his memoirs in 1999. He told him he was done with that after 2 failures and realized the damage that divorce did to his reputation. On April 4, 1996, Sadie Mae Carter, Barry's mother, died in her bedroom at Barry White's house in Clark County, Las Vegas. As he knelt by her bedside, she took her last breaths, and he whispered in her ear how much he loved her as she faded away. It was not a normal mother and son departure scene. It was much more than that. Sadie had been such a huge part of his life, and he in hers. There is no doubting that she was one of those very special women who came along only once in a while. She was a woman who had touched the lives of everyone she had known in a very positive way, and the life she had touched the most was that of her eldest son. He was only too aware that without his mother's influence at the very start of his life, there would have been no Barry White. Of all the people he had rubbed shoulders with in his career, there had been no one greater than his mother. In 1995, during Barry White's Icon Tour, it was debilitating, and almost from the start he had not felt like himself. He was becoming overtired, going to bed early and getting up increasingly later. His girlfriend Catherine Denton, who accompanied him on the tour, found herself playing nurse and did her best to soothe him. She desperately pleaded with him to see a doctor and get a checkup, but he brushed her off with comments like, "Honey, I'm the healthiest man you could ever meet. I don't need any doctors." And that as she watched him puff on 60 cigarettes a day. Even he started to worry that something might be wrong when he started nodding off in public and found that he couldn't make it back to his hotel after a concert without falling asleep in the limousine or coach. Worse still, 3 concerts had to be postponed because of exhaustion. That had never happened to him before, and he hated it. But still, he would not see a doctor, telling Catherine that all he needed to do was rest. Barry White had just started work on a new album, and 2 days into the studio, in October of 2002, he was suddenly taken ill. All the good living had finally caught up with him, and this time there was no way out. As his son Barry White Jr. recalled, the illness came in phases, and the second time around was emotionally traumatic for him and our family. This time there would be no recovery, and doctors told him he needed a kidney transplant if he was to survive. He refused outright to accept any of his own family's kidneys and said he would take his place on the list for a transplant. In May of 2003, he suffered the stroke that finally left him unable to get out of bed. And after that, he never left Cedars-Sinai. 3 scheduled concerts had to be canceled. On the evening of July 3rd, Barry White's heart stopped 3 times, and each time he was revived by doctors. By the morning of the 4th, the end was near. Some reports say he was already dead and kept alive artificially by a heart-lung machine. Barry passed away on the evening of July 4th, 2003. What can I say about his legacy? What a wonderful legacy he left behind. Such beautiful music that will live with us throughout our time here. And what a blessing it was for us to have experienced it. I believe our generation had the best music of all time. And one of the greats was definitely the maestro, Barry White. Peace and love.